Para hacer esta muralla, tráiganme todas las manos, tráiganme todas las manos, los negros sus manos negras, los blancos sus blancas manos.
This project came into life thanks to Anna Grimaldi, Dr. Anna Grimaldi, my colleague, who, when she started here at King's doing her master degree, she started also to work in Senate House Library archives, and especially in that collection of Latin America. So she brought me to see the collection, and since that moment, we start to talk a lot about what we can do in order to activate what is inside those boxes, what we can do to bring it to life, to reactivate the meaning that they have today.
I mean, it's very personal for me. So while I was doing my MA, I was looking for some work experience, and there was a volunteering post at Senate House Library, and the job was basically to catalogue and write little annoying little pieces of paper labels for every single item in those collections, which are over 3,000. And I think maybe it was a year later, I sort of brought the materials to my two supervisors, and yeah, we started this idea of thinking inside the box back then in 2016. But at the time, it was more sort of geared towards other researchers, other lecturers. We were trying to publicize the collection. In 2021, Vinicius came back to me and said, look, how come we don't bring students into this? And that was really where it started in terms of bringing students' interpretation into the materials and turning it into a pedagogical project.
I think my first impression was a little bit of hesitation because I am not from Latin America.
I never really studied Latin America.
As a former history major, I actually didn't really study a lot of Latin American history, unfortunately.
I don't have much of a context when it comes to Latin America, so I thought it was a pretty interesting opportunity to learn more about it.
Well, I got very excited about the idea of having a look at Latin America from a more European perspective, and I was very happy at first to see that so many of our classmates and fellow students were into it.
I think being from Latin America, I just felt like this project was the only way that I could get involved with empowering my nationality.
This is a really innovative project that students are going into the archives and they are discovering new political pamphlets, posters, material, and curating their own exhibition. I think it's brilliant.
So the year 1973, it's always remembered in Latin America because of the coup d'etat in Chile, of course. But it was also a period with several other issues going on in the region that were impactful for the region and as a whole, for the life of people living in the region, but also globally speaking.
Being Latin Americanist scholars, we were very keen from the beginning not to limit it to Chile. And we sort of developed quite a broad definition of 1973 in a sense.
I think a transnational lens really reflects what was happening. It's ahistorical just to think inside the borders of one country.
I'd never been to an archive before, so it was a completely new experience and it was really cool. Just seeing these posters and pamphlets that had been created as forms of kind of resistance to dictatorship. These are pieces of history and it actually, like, you realise people's struggle.
One of the most exciting parts of the project, I think, is when you actually go to the archives and see the material for the first time. I can remember this sense of awe and surprise when you actually open the box and you see other people's faces as well. it's that feeling of not knowing what you're gonna find and not knowing what you're gonna do, but kind of having that intuition that there is something there and you want to find out more.
We were invited to Senate House, and that hands-on bit, we were literally holding these historical posters. I mean, even the smell of all archives is quite enjoyable for me. But holding these posters that did make change.
It was also my first time in an archive, and so interesting. You felt like you were an investigator looking into historical stuff. Like, I think that's very interesting to be in contact with history, actually.
Yeah, again, it just speaks to how artistic expression, whether it be in drawings or political cartoons to like music, it really triggers people's emotions about certain topics, and that's an incredibly effective way to get your message across to people and for them to pay attention to it.
The archive visits were very interesting. Like, I learned a lot of new things I didn't know, and I guess it was just very eye-opening.
I just enjoyed the, being in a musty library and kind of looking through all these materials, the whole being able to choose your own poster and this is my poster.
So we were the team that organized the film screening. I was living in Washington, D.C. before I moved here, and I used to go to these film screenings all the time, and I was like, I just absolutely loved it. The embassies would put them on. I thought it was just such a cool way to get to know more about a country's history, because I think film is just a really interesting way to do that. But on the night, like on the Friday, you kind of could look out in the theater and just say like, oh my gosh, all these people came to see this film that we put on, that we've been working on for months. And people would come up to us afterwards and say that they really enjoyed it and that they were so happy we were doing this. And I think that sort of gratification is like wow, I'm so glad that we ended up doing that. I'm really glad that
producing something that people can enjoy.
Yeah. And seeing people actually enjoy it.
Exactly. And the downside is that moment is just so short.
Yes.
You spend months to organize it, and then it's gone. It's over. You go back home.
Yeah. I think I left it on Friday. I was like, wait, we're done? Like, how is this possible?
Memories, the work of memory, is so different of the factual words of history. But in Argentina, I hope, I aspire that we manage to build up a collective history and a consensus around democracy. This democracy is 40 years now. And with all the problems we had and with the meandering ways that our history took.
This is not a macro history of Cold War. That's a history of human beings. That's a history of victims. That's a history of people that had families, that had mothers, fathers, brothers, children. And if we neglect that, it's easy to go into that sort of big narratives of, oh, look how it was dictatorships in Latin America in the Cold War. No, that is regimes that oppressed people with name, surname, families that were related to us, and we are related to them.
It's very difficult to build those narratives based on evidence without any of the evidence, without any of the documentation. And I think the history of those being hidden, destroyed, I think in many cases, and kept a secret is a big part of that story.
I think it was wonderful. I think one thing that they did really well was involve the Argentine community, which I think was helped along by the involvement of the embassy, but also advertising to the community itself. So it was really nice that and I think really thoughtful that the organisers worked so hard to make sure it could take place on the 24th of March, and I think that gave it a real kind of special character. The fact they were able to put it on the Day of Remembrance, I think, made it even more meaningful, and particularly for the audience there was a kind of more of a sense of a personal investment, whereas I think otherwise often it can feel quite distant. This isn't just history. Obviously I'm a historian, I study it as history, but in these countries, not just in Argentina, obviously in Chile as well, it's so the legacies of the dictatorship, the continued search for justice is so central to the politics of these countries. So I think it was a great success. I really enjoyed it.
I mean, the thing that has been so striking is how long-lasting many of these sources have been, because they should have disappeared in a sense. You know, the dictatorship did everything it could to burn, destroy, wipe out a lot of these images, a lot of these sources. But what is incredible is how many of these have survived.
Everything in those archives is essentially something that the government was trying to either hide or to prevent from happening. So engaging with those materials sort of opens up those political struggles again, and gives a voice to those moments and those individuals and those groups that would otherwise have been sort of lost to history. And in a sense, the archive is disruptive in that way.
I always think that it's like jumping back in the past, It's like if these posters kind of freeze the reality of that time, and they shout out a message that says something about those times. It says something about the people who wanted to communicate and share and propagate that message. But obviously we look at them with the eyes of 2023, and that's not necessarily a disadvantage.
It does give a voice to people who are voiceless. But for me, I think researching these archives was the most interesting part of this entire project, because posters are meant to be ephemeral. They're not supposed to last. They're supposed to be seen, used, discarded. But here is an entire archive dedicated to things that were not meant to be seen, that were not meant to be tracked, that were not meant to last. And here they are.
Having ephemeral material like this, obviously the key point of it is that by nature it's not designed, it's not being made to be kept and to be carefully archived. It's a more popular history in the sense that it's people who didn't have kind of the weight of the state there to organise and look after their paperwork. And it shows, I think, much more how a much broader part of Chilean society, it shows kind of what they were thinking and feeling and doing.
It is really hard to separate your own personal story and baggage from it. I mean, I didn't live through 1973, but my parents did, and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and cousins, so you can kind of come into it with some luggage. But it is important to try and separate yourself, because what we are trying to do is to take different people who understand the world differently and try to get them to see one thing from their very diverse backgrounds.
Again, coming from Latin America and then just seeing all these posters on the Senate House Library, I thought, wow, this is such a different way to see history. It was shocking for me because it's a different scope. When you study Latin America, in Latin America, the narrative of history in Latin America is built by the people that won, But studying from here, it's wide, eye-opening. The scope, it's such a different scope, because here people didn't have fear. Here people really got to express themselves.
I think looking at this year in particular, 50 years after, is important for us to reflect what we have done for our democracies, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world as well. Those posters, when they were created, these posters and pamphlets, they were so powerful and strong in being the instrument for people, oppressed people, voicing their concerns, their protests, their claims. If we leave them lie and sleep in boxes, those voices will be silenced.
The project is almost wrapping up, right? We're coming up to the exhibition date. Will that be the end of it? Probably not. I think ultimately, I don't know where it's going to go, and I think that's the beauty of it.
It's not so much about where I want it to go, but where it wants to go, because we are creating a creature here that is able to speak and to walk. This year we've been working on 1973. Next year we might be working on 1974 or 1964. There are so many inputs that we could decide to develop together. So it is taking its own life and its own trajectory. So we just need to accompany it in the next step.
Every time we come back to it and every time we re-enter the archive and open new archives, there's going to be new interpretations, and I just really look forward to continuing that.
I'm excited for the 17th.
Yeah, can't wait to see you all there.
I can't wait to see you.
Well, stay tuned for our next episode.
rosa y un clavel, abre la muralla, el sable del torneo, cierra la muralla, la paloma y el laurel, abre la muralla, el gusano y el cien pies, cierra la muralla, al corazón del amigo, al veneno y al puñal, al virtu y la hierba buena, la serpiente, al corazón del amigo, al ruiseñor en la flor. Abre la muralla.